Welcome everyone to the Lancet's webinar on Gender Equality Today for Sustainability Tomorrow. I'm Jocelyn Clark from the Lancet, and I'm delighted you have joined us for what promises to be an enriching webinar. And I'm honored that we have such an outstanding group of experts from around the world, whom I'll introduce in a moment. We have had a huge response to this webinar, which shows how important this topic is. Now, more than ever, we must affirm that gender equality is a fundamental human right. It's also a necessary foundation for a peaceful, healthy, and sustainable world. I'd like to do some housekeeping first. I'd like to thank Mike Meads, my colleague at the Lancet, who's producing this webinar, and to everyone who shared news about this webinar and promoted the event. A recording will be available following it. The webinar will entail short presentations from our 4 guest speakers, followed by a question and answer period. Please post your questions anytime starting now into the box on your screen. I'll be collecting these for the question and answer period later in the webinar. You'll also see on your dashboard that we've linked to related content. This also includes a link to the Lancet's brand new online hub, which collects content broadly on equity, diversity, and inclusion. If you'd like to use social media to share information about this webinar, please use hashtags IWD2022 and Lancet Women. I'm delighted to introduce our guest speakers. Dr. Pascale Allotte is the director of the UN University's International Institute for Global Health, and she's also a co-chair of the Lancet's Gender and Global Health Commission. Starting in July, Dr. Allotte will take up the position of director of the WHO Department of Sexual and Reproductive Health. Dr. Aisha Ahmad is senior lecturer in global health at St. George's University of London, where she works to integrate ethics and humanities into global health research and pedagogy. Dr. Nicole DePaula is the founder and executive director of the Women Leaders for Planetary Health, a social enterprise bridging the gaps between the health and environmental sectors through gender-just solutions, and in particular by focusing on support of women from low and middle income countries. And Dr. Marina Romanello is Executive Director of Lancet Countdown, which is an organization across the world of 34 partners tracking progress on health and climate change. International Women's Day this year, on March 8th, was commemorated by the United Nations with its theme, Gender Equality Today for a Sustainable Tomorrow. Inspired by this focus, we planned this webinar to highlight the contributions and global leadership of women on the sustainability agenda, and to urge the action needed to ensure gender equity worldwide to build a more sustainable future for all of us. The Lancet has had a strong interest in many of the areas that form the Sustainable Development Agenda that we'll be discussing today: climate change, migration and health, conflict and humanitarianism, as well as the rights and health of women and girls. There's been more and more interest, certainly I have felt more interest, in the links between these areas, bound as they are to their gender dimensions and the role that gender equity would play in mitigating these threats. Unfortunately, the urgency of the unmet need for meaningful action to deliver gender equality globally is often understated. And yet, women are incredibly vulnerable to the effects of the climate crisis and to any negative impacts that can occur during the migration journey, especially when migration is forced. Women are also, as well as children, increasingly vulnerable in contexts of conflict and war, as we have acutely seen in Syria, Afghanistan, and the Ukraine. Obviously, there is much more depth and diversity of women's experience than simply saying that these phenomena are gendered, and we're going to hear a lot about that today. At the same time, women and girls are resilient, and they are effective leaders in the face of these global and collective challenges. Many groups are working on these issues. Our goal in this webinar is not to be comprehensive. We've only got just less than an hour. But what we really want to do is highlight the importance of these issues around sustainability, and in particular their interlinkages, to signal our interest as a journal in these topics, and to forge new understandings and connections between all of us who have joined to participate in this webinar. My plan is to have each guest provide a few minutes of remarks, discussing their work in this area and highlighting from their point of view some of the most pressing concerns, after which we'll have a Q&A from the audience. So again, please do post your questions to the chat in the box in front of you, and we will register and catalog them for the Q&A portion of the webinar. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us, and I'll hand over now to my colleague, Pascal Alote.
Thank you, Jocelyn, for the opportunity to engage with such esteemed colleagues. Akwaba and Selamat Datang to everybody from the United Nations University International Institute for Global Health in Kuala Lumpur. I'm especially honored because the Lancet is a leading platform of scholarly literature in global health, and for many is considered the definitive voice on the evidence for policy and practice. That puts the Lancet in an incredible position of influence and power, and a power that comes with significant responsibility. This, for me, was an important consideration as we synthesized the inputs for the report of the Lancet Commission on Gender and Global Health with my colleagues Sarah Hawkes from UCL and Global Health 50/50, and Asi El Haji from the Kofi Annan Foundation. Now, as you'll all appreciate, it's a pretty rough time now, and it's very hard to remain optimistic. We're still in the throes of a pandemic. We have a climate crisis, unrelenting environmental disasters, the devastation of our biodiversity, and if that isn't enough, we have persistent civil and political unrest and conflicts, the most recent in the uncomfortable vicinity of some of the most powerful nations. It doesn't need a platform like the Lancet to tell us that at the heart of all these crises are deep-seated inequities, fueled and sustained by the unequal distribution of power, power that is pervasive and inherent in just about every interaction, every relationship, and every structure of our societies. The consequences are highlighted during crisis, are exacerbated by crises, and are sustained through the existing social, cultural, economic, and political structures, and indeed even in the responses that we choose to deal with the various crises. We have therefore chosen in the Commission to focus on one, action. We know the problems, but not the solutions. What can we learn from successes and failures in other areas? And how do we transfer these lessons towards sustainable transformation? Two, we're focusing on the production of health. Inequities are not a disease. Being a woman, a man, transgender, non-binary, these are not disease states. But the box in which global health inhabits sets these issues in a paradigm that is often unworkable. Square peg, round hole. And then we complain that action is limited because these issues are outside the purview of ministries of health or the health sector more broadly. Our commissioners are practitioners and researchers and bring perspectives to gender and global health from areas ranging from anthropology, economics, philosophy, to philanthropy and human rights. That means our entry point for evidence of what works is not from counting the sick and the dead. Just one example, if I may. One of our commissioners, Nina Schwalbe, just completed a stint as the Director of Vaccine Access and Equity for USAID. Through engaging with partners and recipient countries to consistently apply the guidance note for gender in vaccine deployment, that was developed by UNUIGH and UN Women, it became clear, for instance, that where priority frontline staff were the military, for instance, the numbers of those vaccinated were more likely to be men. Where it was community health workers, perhaps more women, unless, of course, it was community health workers who were trained and paid to deliver vaccines to communities. And then, obviously, there's a different gender dynamic because there is also resources associated with it. And then the coverage was skewed in favor of men. Now, the point is that this tool has been an excellent mechanism to socialize and begin to mainstream some of the ideas in gender that have not had sufficient traction in an area that is not traditionally one in which gender is considered relevant. It also provided a critical entry point to raising the importance of collecting disaggregated data, in addition to the contextual information that helps to explain the trends. Now, the third point about the Commission that I'm particularly passionate about is the opportunity to extend the notion and the sources of evidence that are accepted as robust and worthy of consideration for policy and practice. Obviously, with a limited number of commissioners, we cannot nor wish to pretend representativeness. In the interest of reflexivity, however, and with apologies to my fellow commissioners, we are the chattering classes. And so we have taken a decolonial feminist approach to elicit and amplify a broader range of voices, particularly from countries in sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Through this, we are supporting several public engagement and mentoring processes from youth and feminist groups to contribute to the development of the ideas for the report. I think sometimes perhaps we make our colleagues at the Lancet a little bit nervous, but our hope is that this work will ultimately contribute towards progress in an area that can unnecessarily be contentious and will provide approaches for action in other areas of health equity. And I'll end my interventions there. Thank you.
Thank you, Pascal, for your wonderful and passionate remarks. And you by no means make us nervous. You make us so proud at the Lancet for the work that you're doing, and in particular, the sort of disruptive nature that you've just described to us. I have one quick follow-up question for you, because I found it very compelling, your flagging the importance of community-based practice in trying to bridge that gap that we find so unsatisfying between, available evidence and implementation of policy action, the use of community. And it leads me to ask you about the civil society and the importance of women's organizations, for example, as a way to kind of counterbalance some of the powerful actors who determine the global health and sustainability agenda. How important is the civil society to the work that you're doing, and how can the rest of us, researchers, editors among us, support a thriving civil society in this area?
Okay, I believe this goes back to the point about how these issues are conceptualized within the context of global health. So we have one of our working groups is looking specifically at indicators, measures of success, and how meaningful these are to what it is we're trying to achieve. So we do need to recognize, Jocelyn, that there is significant backlash against against what we generally characterize as equity. And so we absolutely have to engage politically. And we know that in spite of all the political challenges, there are people who are working for change. And studies that have catalyzed change are almost always point to the social movements, the grassroots organizations that just get on with what needs to be done, often in spite of prevailing politics and enabling structures. And here we're privileged to have, again, within our commission, Jessica Horn, who has done an exceptional analysis of philanthropy, of the philanthropy ecosystem and ethical feminist philanthropy. Latanya Matt-Frepp as well and her team from the Global Fund for Women are also spearheading efforts to develop new ways of monitoring and funding effective and transformative grassroots feminist work. There's some exceptional scholarship out there if we make the effort to engage with it. I mean, we always tell our students to define their question and then search for the method, rather than start off by being restricted by the orthodoxy. And if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. We have a lot to learn by being inclusive and decolonial in the types of knowledge that we privilege for the purpose of exploring, identifying, scaling up, and transferring sustainable solutions. It is just, the onus is really up to us to just extend ourselves a little bit more to be able to engage with those groups who can help us as partners to develop the evidence base for this.
Thank you, Pascal. I really appreciate your comments and look forward to more Q&A later. I'd like to please ask Aisha Ahmed to come to the floor, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to extend my thank you to Jocelyn and the Lancet team, and particularly my mentors who have been by my side doing very difficult work to enable me to be able to speak some of the things I will say today. You mentioned about one of the most pressing concerns. For me, that is silencing. And there is a significant distinction between being silent and being silenced. And I work in contexts, particularly conflict and humanitarian crises, such as Afghanistan, Kashmir, Pakistan, where there is silencing, and how that silencing impacts on gender-based violence. And what I want to present in the next few moments is a framework around traditional storytelling and how that can create a foundation, a theoretical framework around resistance. So my particular spin-off for this talk today was thinking about women, children, migration, mental health, and I work in these research contexts, but I also work with asylum seekers as an expert witness in the UK, and I can say that all of these aspects are bracketed from the academic literature. The lived experiences of what it means to actually suffer war, we know very little about. The question of what is the essence of war, why is war such a experience of suffering, and particularly how do women survive war? Those are the two questions, my personal and professional questions, that keep me motivated throughout the difficulties I go through with my work. So I'm not going to be using presentation slides or have images or use names of those as examples of those who have passed us by. I'm not going to use numbers or lines to illustrate, to situate where there are movements of bodies trying to move between places on particular pilgrimages to find safety and security. I'm instead going to try to speak to the legacies and to the lullabies of songs that were killed in a dance for health and equality, both for men and women. And this is because when in context of war, war destroys the agency of a story. War destroys the ability to be creative, to be imaginative, to be able to write your own story. Instead, you are writing the story of war. So my points that I wish to make quite sharply as a moment from an academic perspective is that we rely on sustaining our work through gaining epiphanies, through discovering new journeys, developing new frameworks that then can add to pre-existing concepts. And these are the actions of resistance that I referred to earlier about traditional storytelling. Traditional storytelling is not just only a folk story that your grandfather might have told your villagers 50 years ago, but also the ways that we as academics tell our stories. So to turn these stories to the pages of a sustainable story for women and girls suffering from war, and the war on their bodies, on their lands, their viewscapes, their dreams and their memories. war becomes the antithesis of a story. To be a story, there must be something that is created. So we can see the odds of creation here with destruction. And in order to fulfill a world where we can have sustainability, we need to be able to have conditions where we can create sustainability. So let us see our stories. Let us see the wars that lives within the self, the environment and the land, and what has happened to them. And through these stories, let us work hard, work until the story becomes the clock of gender equality throughout all the moments of living and dying. And as one graffiti artist wrote on a very war-torn wall in a country besieged by conflict for many decades, the transcription relates to, let's hope this war is over soon so that I can finish writing this poem. So you see, we do not need only academic advocacy. We also need brave advocacy. We need academics to be brave. So just some of my final point is that disasters, crises, conflicts, warscapes of insecurity, these are all situations. We have enough theory, we have enough knowledge to understand the structural aspects that lead to how they become disasters, and typically ones that are systematically formed from neglect and often from intentional operations of violence, of systemic and targeted violence. And to tackle these, we need to weaken vulnerability through resistance and advocacy and stricter moral compromises. It is not just about responding to the vulnerability. It is about deconstructing the structures which create the vulnerability. So we need to come together to spur action that can desecrate these harmful structures. That said, there does also need to, we also do need to address immediate health interventions following acute needs and risks, and that's part of the work that I do. What does it mean to respond to post-traumatic stress disorder in Afghanistan when there's 4 decades of conflict? How can we even begin to tackle PTSD in that situation when there's no post-trauma? So in such circumstances, there will be different vulnerabilities. No one is immune, whether they're men, women, but the humanities can help us to surface the suffering that is continued and buried within, especially in context of stigma and the dangers of disclosing gender-based violence. We need to speak from, not to the stories, as well as listening as a good listener. We need to receive stories. Often I'm told, you're giving voice to the voiceless. And I feel really perturbed by that, because there is no one who is voiceless. If that voice is not heard, that is because of structural silencing around that individual or community. So to conclude, receiving stories is a normative act, it's an ethical endeavor, and we can continue through our conceptual loss of how we understand vulnerability in war, whether our humanitarian health efforts are life-saving and or life-sustainable for those who are vulnerable, to climate change, to conflict, and to other such humanitarian crises. We can only achieve this if we know the suffering that we're responding to during people's lives. We need to understand people better. We need to understand suffering. And on that note, I will conclude and say with once again, my special thanks, particularly to St. George's, University of London, Land Body Ecologies, who are funding this project with the Wellcome Trust, and SHARE, which is the Judicial Storytelling Intervention project that we worked on in Afghanistan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aisha, for those very powerful remarks and shining light on an aspect of, uncovering knowledge and understanding of these areas through your work, particularly bringing the humanities. And I think there's a theme developing between yourself and Pascal, which is this importance of stimulating and privileging different types of methodologies and different forms of evidence to build the evidence base for action. And I want to ask you the question, because I know you work so hard in this area, how receptive have you found the global health community, particularly decision makers, how receptive have they been to the incorporation of some of the methods and ways of seeing and learning that you just described to us, and the use of storytelling, for example?
I think there's a juxtaposition. On one hand, there's a recognition of the global mental health gap. On the other hand, there is certain viewpoints about qualitative research in global health and the involvement of participatory research, as well as conducting research in conflict areas. So those are challenges that I think there's more discourses that are evolving at the moment to see how we can foster humanities research in these contexts. Yes, sorry, I had one more point, but maybe we'll come later. Thank you.
Okay, we can come back to it. Thank you very much. And I'm very happy to next welcome Nicole DePaula, please.
Thank you, everyone. What a powerful talk so far. It's such a pleasure to be with inspiring minds. Thank you for the invitation. So hello, everyone. Good morning from my side of the world, and thank you for tuning in today. After 2 years of this intense digitalization, I really appreciate the time that you take to be on one more digital space connecting with us today. So although Women's Day is really every day, I truly like the framing of our topic, this gender equality today for a sustainable tomorrow. And this is because it really summarizes one of my greatest professional and personal missions, which is work to prove that women are not victims, but powerful seeds of change. And when we empower women, we help to promote one of my greatest passions, when we talk so much about planetary health. So we don't have time to go into detail, but just very briefly, planetary health is this recognition that human health is intrinsically connected to the health of our natural ecosystems, of our planet. It is a refined way to think about public health in the Anthropocene, right? This time when we humans are being most powerful forces transforming our only home. So science really teaches us the idea of this infinite growth on a planet with finite resources cannot be so wise. And our addiction to fossil fuels, and we're seeing now particularly in this moment in history, it's so brought many social economic benefits, but now it seems to pose some of the existential risks that we are facing, and powerfully now illustrating the negative impacts through climate change that we're going to hear soon more details, and this unprecedented loss of natural resources. So planetary health highlights a modern paradox that to me is so important. It is clear that at the speed that we are destroying nature, we are putting our species in danger. And the exact pathway that gave us so much in public health improvement could now become a threat. So one could argue that we are becoming perhaps a little bit of the victims of our own success. But the real question is, how can we change direction? And besides this unprecedented speed of anthropogenic environmental change, we also find ourselves guilty for not doing enough to address the historical systemic injustice. And unfortunately, humanity learns the hard way. It took us a catastrophic pandemic to connect the dots among many areas of sustainable development. But some parts of this development puzzle remain overlooked. And as we can see, I think I like just this figure because you see that equity and social justice are essential to promote planetary health. And it's, of course, very dramatic that we haven't left COVID-19, and this pandemic really opened the door for not a recession, but a she-cession. And it's women being disproportionately impacted. We can see this through the health, seeing the crisis of health and education, on the burden of unpaid care work, on gender-based violence. There are so many statistics and numbers that proving that. But to give you an example, I'm from Brazil, and seeing what is happening in Latin America and the Caribbean, we saw that with the lockdowns, some statistics showing that women already who are used to do a lot, they were facing 1 extra hour every day of unpaid work during the lockdowns. And maybe we can put in the chat, what do you think, how much it added for men? Statistics showed that 7 minutes. So we're talking about how the responsibility that we had during this lockdown were not, of course, equally shared. So I'm just sharing here some resources that we are trying to put these ideas, so you can take a look in another time. But we are in 2022, and we have the UN that estimating that it would need us more than 100 years to close the gender gap, for example, in political parity. And I don't know about you, but I don't have this time. And we are really precious for change. And we are virtually connected here today because we want a different future, a future that works for 100% of people. And because I'm relatively impatient, also a fan of science, I dedicate a lot of time uniting these like-minded people to break the silence for planetary health, connect the dots between fields, disciplines, institutions, and people. So I see myself as a knowledge pollinator. I believe that the change will only happen when we get out of our comfort zone. So I think every day when I work speaking even about gender, I see myself doing that. And I just wanted to share briefly, because when I founded the Women Leaders for Planetary Health, the main goal was to demonstrate that the fields of health, environment, and gender are deeply interconnected. And yet these fields were not necessarily talking to each other. In fact, social movements are often fragmented. And by acknowledging the benefits that women bring to the table, or by the way, we should maybe fix the table, not only having a seat at the table, but even if the table is broke, we need to fix that. But we could start closing so many gaps. And this is just a photo, the moment that I had as maybe of aha moment there when I was in Rwanda, and you see these women when we are really protecting resources and being trusted by the community to share water equitably. But at the same time, this is a national park, Volcanoes National Park, and when the community had to also understand the value of wildlife, the endangered mountain gorillas being there. And I was in a meeting for women leaders in global health, and I really thought, well, why nobody's talking about the most important part of our here, what is around us is so important for human health as well. So I tried to connect this and was happy to have the support that on the other picture here, you see in a small window that now after 2 years has expanded to more than 30 countries, people participating in our programs, mentorships. But we were at the United Nations, the Climate Change Conference, sharing, as you see, it's not a typical side event, it was a dialogue to explain that why we need it and how we could empower more women. So a little bit to ensure that change, we need to go beyond the technical aspects, right? We need to invest in the future talents to really do 3 things: dismantle the social and cultural barriers withholding women from leadership positions, support future change makers in influential sectors, for example, in technology, and disrupted our outdated systemic bias and prejudice that block women from accessing high quality education and financial support to become also successful entrepreneurs. So I think we're trying to do this at the Women Leaders of Planetary Health, building a space to encourage women to drive this positive change and then connect to this idea of planetary health. And I wanted to conclude here because I mentioned, and Aisha beautifully brought this issue of storytelling and how we don't need to give voice to the voiceless. And I would like to pay tribute to this, and I would highly also encourage this book that you can see on the side. You can download today. It's an open access. When we have this Brazilian Berta Lutz, when in 1945, she was sent to the San Francisco Conference, which founded the United Nations. And there were only 3% of women of this 160 participants. You can see in the picture here, it's a very rare species there to be a woman. But thanks to the strength of Berta Lutz, a Brazilian woman, supported by Latin American women, also bringing the idea here of the importance acting, inserting in the United Nations founding chart the idea of equal rights of men and women. So this is just a fascinating story of how women from the global South shaped history, but had their stories somehow lost or erased, and this book brings the details of that story. So that's why, to us, it's a central commitment at the Women Leadership Volunteer to empower women, particularly in the Global South. Thank you so much, Jocelyn, for the opportunity to be with all of you today.
Oh, thank you, Nicole, so much. So you've given us a taste of what a planetary health approach might look like to generate change within the gender and sustainable agenda, but you've also given us some very good signals about the relationship between women's leadership and progressive outcomes in health and environment. I would love to ask you a million questions, but I really think it would be best for us to just carry on with Marina's talk next, please, Marina, because they are so interconnected, and then we'll have lots of time at the end for questions. Thank you again, and over to you, Marina. Thank you.
Thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you everyone for being here. Thank you obviously to the Lancet for this great event and this invitation, and to the other speakers. I'm really humbled to be among these amazing women today. So I am the Executive Director for the Lancet Countdown, and I'm going to tell you a bit about our approach to gender and the challenges that we've faced. The Lancet Countdown is an organization that looks at climate change in particular, so that aspect of planetary health. And when we look at climate change affects our health both directly and indirectly through many interconnected pathways, and affects almost every aspect of our health, our non-communicable diseases, communicable diseases, the social and environmental determinants of health. But something that is really important is that all of those impacts of climate change on health are sieved and are determined by social dynamics. And when we think about gender cuts across all of our social dynamics by definition. And gender inequities are deeply embedded in those social mechanisms that will determine the extent to which climate change affects us, affects women, affects men, and affects other genders. Why do we talk about gender and vulnerabilities? Gender-associated vulnerabilities come from social, economic, and cultural factors mainly. In the case of women, you also have physical factors like pregnancy, lactation that make women physically vulnerable. But everything else around gender inequities are determined by our social and cultural norms. And the reason why it's so important to look at this in the context of climate change is that those inequities will lead to a feedback loop, whereby those people that are the least advantaged, including in many societies women, will be more exposed to climate hazards, will have less means to protect themselves from those hazards, and will have less resources to recover from those climate hazards. So when climate change strikes, the people that were already in a disadvantaged position are left in an even more disadvantaged position. And that is the case of women across most countries around the world. But it's also important to note that gender inequities are not only a problem of women, they also include men in that problematic because of those gender roles. Because men sometimes make part of the labor force that is the most exposed to climate hazards when they work, for example, in the construction sector. And because those gender inequities means that when we respond to an extreme weather event, we have different roles that are predetermined to different genders that define how we're able to respond and protect ourselves. Women in general have stronger care roles in most societies, and that means that they are less capable of taking their own decisions, of moving, of migrating when they need to. They have to care for others. So there's an immobility factor there that makes them particularly vulnerable to extreme weather events. And we're also seeing gender inequities not only from the point of view of the impacts and how climate change is affecting us, but also in our response. There's a very small picture here. I don't think you can see it, but that is the main delegates of COP26 that happened in Glasgow. And I dare you identify how many women were in that group. It's not that many. And the interesting thing there is that there's very good studies showing that when you have gender equity in decision-taking and in power, then climate action is more effective, is more equitable, And we have very good studies demonstrating that. The same happens in companies. Companies that have women as leaders have much better climate plans, have much better social plans in place. And that doesn't have to do with women being so fantastic and so marvelous, which we could argue we are, but it has to do with the fact that gender equity and gender balance helps decision-taking and helps keeping into account the whole dimensions of climate change and different vulnerable groups and the action towards them. So from the point of view of the Lancet Countdown, what we do is monitor progress on health and climate change. We produce as much as we can quantitative evidence to track the health impacts of climate change and the health implications of our response to climate change. And challenged by the Lancet, challenged by Wellcome, and by our own interest in looking at vulnerable groups and particularly at gender, in our latest report, we tried to see how much we could expose gender inequities through our indicators. So we set up a workforce last year. We started doing a systematic literature review to try to look at all of the evidence, all of the literature touching upon climate change and health and gender. We contacted big groups working on the topic for their expertise and included them in our report, like UN Women. We also worked with Sarah Hawkes, that was just mentioned, and the group working on the Lancet Gender Commission. And we resorted to other groups that have a breadth of expertise on this. And then we systematically assessed each of our 44 indicators and where gender was an issue for them. And we found that by far, almost all of our indicators are cut across by gender inequities issues. Gender determines the impacts of climate change and also define the response to climate change. And that was relevant to most of our indicators. However, of our 44 indicators, we try to look for gender or even sex disaggregated data and try to see whether we could expose this numerically. And what we found is that only 6 of them, for only 6 of them did we find gender disaggregated data that would allow us to expose and to quantify the magnitude of this problem. So this is kind of our big conclusion for this. It's invisible to us. We're not even quantifying gender inequities. We're not quantifying the extent to which different genders are being impacted differently, where those inequities lie, and how the response is being or not gender sensitive. So ensuring that gender is represented across our quantification, our national statistics, national strategies is fundamental to be able to expose the true dimensions of this challenge and to be able to respond in a way that is commensurate to those inequities and protects not only women, not only men, but the whole of society from those gender inequities that cut across, and particularly empowering women and protecting them from the biggest climate hazards that they're today facing. Oh, sorry, that's the end of mine, Jocelyn. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. Really appreciate you giving an overview to the audience of both the Countdown Project, but also reviewing very helpfully some of the evidence that has been generated over many, many decades of the relationship between gender and health and environmental outcomes, but also between women's decision-making, representation, and outcomes. And indeed, one of the questions that I was so curious to learn about was the extent to which you were able to include equity dimensions into the indicators that your organization is tracking and reporting annually. And you've answered the question that actually you're quite limited, it seems, by the availability of data. So the natural question to ask you is, given that Lancet Countdown is not just a data gathering organization, but you're very much an advocacy organization driving social change on, this incredible opportunity that exists to confront the current climate crisis. What are you doing to agitate and advocate for change in these data sources so that gender and sex aggregated data are collected and are made available for you to track and monitor the extent to which gender differences or disparities are not worsened by some of the climate action that's underway?
Yeah, that's a really big challenge, actually. And we've been working with amazing actors in this, like, for example, UN Women. UN Women is developing this survey, and they're enrolling a survey to try to collect data and to expose the inequities of gender across the world. And they're already providing that service to multiple countries. So we've been working with them to try and see where those questions could be tweaked or could be changed in order to better reflect the climate change component of these inequities that they're monitoring. We're also working to develop indicators. We're trying to help countries develop their own indicators, and in that we're also incorporating that lens. It's quite interesting, and I think that happens across all of the sciences, really, how when we enroll this service, when we start collecting the data, we're not even asking the question about gender. So it wouldn't take so much effort to incorporate gender in that data collection. The problem is that we're not even thinking about it. So just posing that question could really help gather that extra point, that extra box that allows you to identify those gender inequities. So it's not such an enormous challenge. The problem is that we haven't been addressing it at all practically up until now. And yeah, it's hard to get countries to change the way they're doing things. But as more and more countries start developing their national observatories on climate and health, that gives us a new opportunity to incorporate gender dimensions into those.
Thank you. Thanks for your response, Marina, and your candor, because I think indeed there is an observation that not enough acknowledgement and effort has gone into looking at dimensions of equity within the climate change agenda. That may be true also of the migration agenda, and that you're able to embrace that as part of your future planning is really fantastic, and we'll look forward to supporting your work as you go forward. While people are collecting themselves and pinging more questions to me, please, we're going to do a quick poll. If you don't mind, Mike, putting up the poll question for our audience. So just a quickie poll, 30 seconds. What is most needed in your mind to advance the gender and sustainability agenda? 4 options there for you, and we'll come back to the results at the end. So I've got some great questions in the chat box, and the challenge is going to be how to prioritize them and ensure that there's that we're able to address all these wonderful questions we're getting from the audience. But perhaps I'll go to you first, Nicole. There has been a theme emerging from our conversation today about the importance of increasing the representation of women in leadership and decision-making roles. So that seems clear that that's important. It doesn't tell the whole story, of course, because we can't just entirely rely upon women to step in and disrupt structures that have favored men, and particularly men from high-income countries, for so long. Nevertheless, could you add some more examples, please, for our audience of what your organization and your work is doing to advance what you call gender-just solutions? So using your planetary health lens, what are some other gender-just solutions in addition to advocating for more women in leadership roles?
Thanks, Jocelyn. And very important question on this leadership, because one of the things, and as we learn now, the difficulty to gather the data. There's so many statistics out there, right? So many numbers are not a good illustration, and we are not, with the pandemic now, for example, in Latin America, we went back 18 years of progress regarding gender equality. So what do we see? That one of the things that we notice is first, let's say the people who come to us and want to participate, and we set up a digital academy trying to bring the science of planetary health, specifically digitally, to countries where we wouldn't, normally we see a lot of planetary health happening in Europe and North America and in Australia. And we had a big effort to bring this conversation to Latin America, to Africa. And there are many initiatives there, and people who are in our team as well, establishing new hubs of planetary health. So one of the examples on the leadership is what I observe, and that's perhaps less even scientific, but a lot of the softer skills are sometimes needed. It's not only, gathering more data or training the women, but sometimes we see it's not a lack of confidence, but because of social norms are sometimes not favoring women to take these roles and feel comfortable in those roles. We see that leadership and mentorship programs through coaching and being among peers, not only through the academic part that we are doing it and exchanging that, but having this support of the network is something that I'm noticing that is very valued. And people feel that makes a difference. And sometimes sharing, women would tend to think, oh, I only have the problem, or I'm not allowed to say that, or not. This, more personal aspects that sometimes we don't take into account when we're talking about transformation. But most of this change that we need to see, and many of our colleagues mentioned today, is at the cultural level. So how do we change social norms? What is normalized? What is allowed or not allowed? So I think that's one of the things we were having the leadership programs with specific people with those skills to kind of unleash the power that all women already have in them, but that they feel more confident to lead their own solutions sometimes. And I think then the challenge that I would like to bring in, and although we can expand gender studies, so that what I really would like to see is a change, is the mainstream of gender in budgets and financial institutions being more involved. And it's not a women's affair, right? It's if we have gender equality, it's a benefit for the whole society. So I think the change will happen when we see our budgets at the national level taking this into consideration and really valuing investing in this type of programs, and also delivering funds to women-led business. That's another, even you say, for example, in the United States, we have 3% or so much the low of venture capital money going to women's business. And that's a reality in developed countries. So I think we need to go through this transformation, both with technical and softer skills. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to our colleague in the audience who posed that question in the chat. So to you, Aisha, please, the next question from one of our audience members who says, there's a number of questions for you, so I'm going to combine them. But one colleague says that they really like the phrases brave advocacy and deconstructing vulnerability. And the question following from that, though, to you, Aisha, is how do you confront those viewpoints or assumptions that forms of data like oral narratives or traditional storytelling aren't, the so-called evidence that we're used to having formed some of the decisions that we take in global health and sustainability? How do you confront those concerns that those types of data aren't strong enough evidence?
I would take a two-pronged approach. The first is about and I feel very passionate about this. I don't know if I fulfill my own passion, but I'm trying my best in terms of if we are working in this area, we have to be brave academics. I will speak to you the same way as I would talk to the Taliban. And that is how it has to be. There comes a line when we have to decide where we've talked a little bit about social, cultural norms, but we have to work on that as well. The other aspect in terms of how we gain more validation for evidence that might not be seen as the gold standard of an RCT is to keep on doing it, to keep on doing more of that research, to keep on publishing it. And when I'm providing my academic reports for asylum seekers, I rely on academic literature. If that literature is not there, then from the Home Office perspective, and hopefully no one's listening, then it's an absence. So I've had an Iraqi Kurdish case recently of an honor violence, and his partner was killed by her father, and he was tortured. But because in the UK, all of the honor violence is focused on women, the Home Office conclusion was honor violence only happens to men. So we have to keep on gaining these. I know many people in my communities who've had experiences that I've done extensive literature reviews and they are not in the literature. So academics have a responsibility to make sure that they are finding the right stories and that they are asking the right questions and that they are completing the nuances in the academic literature to be able then to give a stronger base to counteract the dominant discourses.
Thank you, Aisha. And I really feel like there's probably some messages there for medical journals and other scholarly journals as well to really broaden our minds as to, the type of evidence that can form understanding of these issues. And I really thank you for that and for your work. I just want to note that Pascal, unfortunately, has had to slip away to deal with the situation. So I've said goodbye to her on my phone with many thanks for her participation. Next question. Let's throw up the poll results. Why don't we, Mike? And then I'm going to pose the next question to you, Marina, to close our session. Oh, so this is interesting. Oh, I love this. So it's, in some ways it's kind of balanced. So we asked the question, what's most needed to advance the gender and sustainability agenda? And more research on gender differences and better links between the climate change and the gender and health communities were ticked by some of our audience. But the leading two were in the first category that we need more of an intersectionality lens, and also that we need to use what's already existing in terms of an evidence base and push for that to be implemented with policy action, with thanks to everyone who participated. So to you, Marina, this will be our last question before we say goodbye to everyone. There's some questions in the chat for you about the extent to which gender equity can be supported to generate more progressive climate action. So can you say something about the importance of, investing in women landowners, small-scale farmers, what that generates in terms of, Nicole brought up social businesses. How does investing in empowering women help us lead effectively to the kind of positive climate action we're looking for?
Thank you, Jocelyn. That's a very interesting question. I think the easy answer to that is because you cannot exclude over 50% of the world's population in your plans, right? You cannot systematically exclude over 50% of the world population. And that's it, really. However, because women have gendered roles and because those gendered dimensions underpin societies as well, then there's also a differential role in women that we've embedded to different genders in that response, but only because those gendered roles exist, if that makes sense. Apart from that, so taking into account those gender roles and gender norms, women now do have a lot of power to drive a sustainable response to the climate crisis in particular. When we look at different societies, at different gendered roles, women are fundamental to the social matrix. They are embedded in their own societies and they have those networks through family, through education, through the raising of the children that makes them fundamental actors of change. When you have women that are not educated and women are in charge of the education and the bringing up of a family, that transpires through generations and generations. So you also have a generational inequity problem. Whereas when you empower women, when you give them access to education, when you empower them to bring food to the table, which is many times the role of women, by also giving them access to the land and control and ownership over the natural resources, when you empower women financially so that they can generate their own endeavors, that they can have their own independence and drive sustainable economic development, then you're generating a society in which those that are in charge of raising the family, are in charge of raising future generations, and are fundamental to the social matrix, are being deeply embedded in the response to climate change and therefore can provide a response that will benefit the whole of society. And there's a lot of publications, I'm not an expert on this, but there's a lot of publications that we've reviewed extensively showing how this is the case. And also showing how oftentimes, and in the vast majority of times, that is not what's currently happening. So while women are responsible for something like 80% of the food production in low middle income countries, they only own 10% of the land. So that shows you just how difficult we're making the task of bringing food to the table, how difficult it is for women to be able to produce a sustainable response and to have sustainable means of food production and to deliver a sustainable future as well. So there's a lot to be said about
thank
how
you,
those
Marina. Thank you, Marina.
Yeah,
I'll stop you there because we're just about to run over time. And I just want to thank you and Nicole and Aisha and Pascal for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure and an honor. I want to thank everyone who joined us on this webinar. We could have spent all afternoon talking about this issue. There were so many questions that I couldn't get to, but it shows your interest, and we very much would like to signal our own. So thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to future discussions. Bye, everyone.